A boy helped a worker pull a heavy cable, not knowing that this would change his life. The next day, a black car stopped in front of his house, and when the door opened, he couldn't believe what he saw. It was one of those days when the heat seemed to press down on everything. Tommy pedaled his bike down the street, his shirt sticking to his back, and his eyes scanning the neighborhood. It wasn't like he was trying to escape anything, but the walls at home felt too tight lately. The overdue rent, his mom's stress, and the constant tension, it all just made it harder to breathe inside. As Tommy rounded the corner, he saw something up ahead. There was an older man, white hair, a lined face, wearing a high-visibility vest, struggling with what looked like a bunch of thick black cables. The cables were sprawled across the grass, half in the street, and the man was clearly having trouble moving them. Tommy slowed down and stopped a few feet away, leaning on his bike handles. "Hey, mister," Tommy called out. "Need a hand with that?" The old man looked up, wiping the sweat off his forehead with his sleeve. His face lit up a little at Tommy's offer, even though his brow stayed creased from the strain. "Yeah, I could sure use some help," he said, nodding. "These cables aren't getting any lighter, that's for sure." Tommy set his bike down and jogged over. The man handed him a pair of work gloves. "Name's Thomas," the man said. "And you are?" "Tommy," he answered, sliding on the gloves. The gloves were a little too big, but they would work. "Tommy, huh?" Thomas smiled. "Looks like we're meant to work together then, huh? All right, let's get these cables moved." They both grabbed onto the cables. Tommy grunted as he lifted his end. It was heavy, heavier than it looked, and his muscles strained against the weight. Thomas shifted, pulling his side, and they began to inch forward. The heat wasn't helping. The sun felt like it was directly above them, burning into their skin. Tommy could feel his arms shaking, but he didn't want to stop. They managed to move a few feet when Tommy heard voices. He glanced up and noticed a couple of neighbors watching from across the street. One of them, a lady in a bright pink house dress, had her arms crossed over her chest, her mouth twisted in disapproval. "What's that boy doing with the cables?" she muttered to the man beside her, who just shrugged but kept his eyes locked on Tommy. Tommy felt his face heat up, and it wasn't just the sun. He focused on the cables, pretending not to hear them. He tugged harder, and Thomas gave a little nod. "Doing good, kid. Just a bit more." They kept pulling step by step. The cables scraped against the pavement, and the effort seemed to take forever. Tommy's hands hurt, even through the gloves, but he pushed the pain aside. Just as they were about to finish moving the last of it, Tommy caught sight of another figure approaching. A man, in a dark blue uniform, one of the neighborhood security guards. Tommy straightened, his grip loosening. "Hey, what's going on here?" the guard called out, his voice sharp. Thomas looked up, frowning. "We're just getting these cables into position for the installation," he said, his tone calm but firm. The guard's eyes flicked to Tommy, narrowing. "Who's the kid? He shouldn't be touching that stuff." Tommy clenched his jaw, feeling his pulse quicken. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat felt tight. "He's helping me," Thomas said, stepping a little closer to Tommy. "He's doing a good job, too." The guard still looked skeptical. He stepped closer, and Tommy could feel his chest tightening, the guard's eyes drilling into him like he was trouble. "All right," the guard finally said, though his expression said he still didn't like it. "Just make sure you're careful. Don't want any accidents." He turned, giving Tommy one last long look before walking away. Tommy let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Thomas gave him a pat on the shoulder. "Don't mind him, kid," Thomas said. "You did good. People get worked up over nothing sometimes." Tommy nodded, swallowing hard. He tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks, Mr. Thomas," he said. "No problem. You really helped me out today, Tommy. I owe you one," Thomas said, taking the gloves back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a couple of dollars, holding them out to Tommy. Tommy shook his head. "I can't take that, Mr. Thomas. I was just helping." Thomas smiled. All right. But you ever need anything, you just let me know, okay?" Tommy nodded again, picking up his bike. As he pedaled away, he glanced back at Thomas, who was giving him a wave before getting back to work. Tommy felt a small sense of pride, but it was mixed with something else. A tightness in his chest. A reminder of those eyes watching him like he didn't belong. By the time he got home, the sun had dipped lower in the sky. His mom was in the kitchen, her back turned as she scrubbed a pan in the sink. "Where were you, Tommy?" she asked, her voice already carrying that tired edge. She didn't even need to turn around. Tommy hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Just helping out around the neighborhood," he said finally. His mom sighed, setting the pan down. She turned, her eyes softening when she saw his sweaty face, the tired look in his eyes. "You gotta be careful out there, Tommy," she said quietly. "People, they don't always see the good in you." "I know, Mom," Tommy said, looking at the floor. "I just wanted to help." She came over, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I know, baby. I know. But you gotta stay out of trouble. We got enough going on without you getting into it, all right?" Tommy nodded. "Yeah, I get it." She kissed his forehead, and he pulled away gently, heading to his room. As he closed the door behind him, he leaned against it for a moment, the weight of the day settling into his bones. He felt a mix of pride and exhaustion, but mostly he felt the pressure to do the right thing, to help, without bringing trouble down on his family. Tommy woke up the next morning to the sound of raised voices. He sat up in bed, blinking sleep from his eyes, and listened. His mom's voice was coming from the kitchen, sharp and anxious. He could hear her talking to someone, but the words were muffled. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and pulled on a shirt, stepping out of his room quietly. In the kitchen, his mom stood by the counter, holding a piece of paper. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped, her face tight with stress. Across from her was Mrs. Jenkins, their neighbor, who was shaking her head and speaking softly. "I'm really sorry, Alicia," Mrs. Jenkins was saying, "but you know how they are. They're not going to wait much longer." Tommy took a step closer. His mom noticed him then, and her eyes flicked to the paper she held. Tommy knew what it was before she even said it. "Tommy," she sighed, waving Mrs. Jenkins out of the house. "Go get ready for school. We got a notice. They're talking about eviction." The words hit Tommy like a punch. He looked at his mom, his heart sinking. "Eviction," he repeated. "How soon?" 30 days, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She crumpled the paper in her hand. "If we don't catch up on rent, they're going to kick us out." Tommy's stomach felt like it was full of rocks. He glanced at his mom, saw the tears she was fighting back, and looked away. The tight feeling in his chest got worse. He nodded, turning away and heading to the bathroom. He splashed water on his face, staring at himself in the mirror. 30 days. Where were they supposed to go after that? He had to do something. Anything. Later that afternoon, Tommy was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his school books. But none of the words were sinking in. His little brother Jordan was running a toy car over the table's edge, making engine noises, and his baby sister Maya was in her high chair, babbling happily. Their mom was out working her second job, cleaning houses for some of the families who lived on the nicer side of town. Tommy looked at his brother, then at his sister, and felt the weight pressing down on him. He thought about leaving school. Maybe if he found work, he could help. They could pay the rent and maybe even have enough left over to make things a little easier. "Hey, Jordan," he said, watching his brother's face light up. "You want to help me with something?" Jordan looked up from his toy car. "What is it?" "Come on, let's go clean up the living room," Tommy said, trying to smile. "Let's get it all nice for when Mom gets back." Jordan nodded and jumped up, happy to help. Tommy pushed himself up from the table, his eyes catching the eviction notice lying on the counter. He clenched his jaw and turned away, focusing on his brother instead. That evening, his mom came home, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Tommy could see the dark circles under her eyes, the way she moved like every step hurt. She walked in and stopped, her eyes widening a little as she took in the living room. Jordan had picked up all his toys, and Tommy had swept the floor. "You boys did this?" she asked, her voice soft. Jordan beamed. "Yeah, Tommy said we should make it nice for you." Tommy just nodded, avoiding her eyes. She smiled, but there was still sadness behind it, and Tommy could see it. She walked over and kissed Jordan's head, then looked at Tommy, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she whispered. Tommy just nodded again, the tightness in his chest still there. After Jordan went to bed, Tommy and his mom sat in the small kitchen. She made a pot of tea, though they barely had any food in the cupboards. She sipped at it slowly, staring at the worn table. "Tommy," she said eventually, "about what's happening. I don't want you to worry about it, okay?" "How can I not?" he said, his voice barely holding back the frustration. 30 days, Mom. And then what? Where are we supposed to go?" She sighed, her hands trembling a little as she set her mug down. "I don't know, but I'm going to figure something out. I'm working as much as I can. You just need to focus on school, all right?" Tommy shook his head. "School's not going to pay the rent. I could get a job, help out." "No," she said, her voice sharp. "You're 13, Tommy. You're supposed to be going to school. You're not supposed to be thinking about this." Tommy felt his face heat up, anger bubbling in his chest. "I'm thinking about it because no one else is. I don't want to get kicked out, Mom. I'm tired of seeing you crying every night. Tired of pretending like everything's fine when it's not." His mom's eyes welled up, and she turned her face away, her jaw clenched tight. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and heavy. Finally, she looked back at him, her eyes red. "I know you're trying to help, but it's my job to figure this out, Tommy. Not yours. I can't lose you too." Tommy swallowed hard, the anger fizzling out. He looked away, nodding slowly. "All right," he whispered, "I get it." She reached over, her hand resting on top of his. "I just need you to be safe, okay? I need to know you're safe." Tommy nodded again. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything left to say. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Tommy sat on the fire escape outside their apartment, the cool air doing nothing to take away the tight feeling in his chest. He looked down at the street below, the dim streetlights casting shadows across the cracked pavement. He could hear a couple of people talking a few buildings down, their voices carried on the night breeze. Then he heard something else. His mom's voice. She was on the phone, talking in low, hushed tones, and Tommy leaned back, trying not to eavesdrop. But her words cut through the quiet of the night. "We might have to move in with my sister if I can't get the money together," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what else to do. I'm trying, but I can't make it work on my own." Tommy felt his throat tighten. He swallowed hard, his fingers digging into the rusted metal of the fire escape. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let his mom keep breaking herself down for them like this. He had to find a way to help, even if she didn't want him to. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. He needed to think, needed to figure out a plan. He couldn't just sit there and do nothing. He wouldn't. The next morning, Tommy was up early, his thoughts still racing. He ate breakfast quietly, watching his mom rush out the door to her first job. He didn't have school that day. It was a teacher planning day, so he had time to think. He grabbed his bike, deciding to ride around the neighborhood for a bit. He needed to clear his head and maybe get some ideas on what to do next. He rode past the houses, most of them quiet in the early morning light. When he turned the corner, he saw the old man again, Mr. Thomas struggling with another set of cables, just like the day before. Tommy stopped, staring for a moment. The man looked up and saw him, giving him a nod. "Morning, Tommy," Thomas said, smiling. "Fancy seeing you again." Tommy forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Need some help again, Mr. Thomas?" Thomas nodded, his face lined with exhaustion. "Wouldn't say no to it, kid. These things don't get any easier with age." Tommy got off his bike, grabbing the gloves Thomas offered him. They got to work, just like the day before, but today, Tommy's mind was somewhere else. He pulled at the cables, his body straining, but all he could think about was the eviction notice, his mom's voice on the phone, and the tightness in his chest that refused to go away. They worked in silence for a while, the sound of the cables dragging on the ground echoing through the empty street. Tommy could feel his hands aching, the weight of the cables making his arms burn. But he didn't stop. "Thanks again for the help, Tommy," Thomas said as they finally finished. "You're a good kid." Tommy just nodded, taking off the gloves and handing them back. He watched as Thomas went back to his truck, and he stood there for a moment, staring down at his hands. His fingers were red and raw, but he barely felt the pain. He turned, getting back on his bike, and started pedaling home. His heart was pounding, and his mind was spinning with ideas, plans, anything that could help his mom, help his family. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. He had to do something. He just didn't know what yet. The next day, Tommy woke up with a sense of unease hanging over him. The tension at home hadn't lifted. His mom was still rushing between her jobs, and the eviction notice was a constant reminder on the kitchen counter, taunting them with the 30-day deadline. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the anxious feeling in his chest. He had no school that morning, so he thought maybe getting out of the house would help. He slipped out the door before his siblings woke up, hoping a bike ride might clear his head. The streets were quiet in the early hours, the neighborhood still waking up. Tommy kept his head down as he pedaled, avoiding the stares of anyone who happened to be out. As he rode along, the heat from the morning sun was already rising, warming the pavement beneath him. He took a deep breath, hoping to calm himself. He needed to find a way to help, but every idea seemed impossible. He was just a kid. What could he do? As he turned the corner of Maple Street, Tommy spotted something that made his heart skip a beat. A large black car was parked in front of his house. It was one of those shiny, official-looking cars, the kind you didn't see much in their neighborhood. His stomach twisted in a knot, and his palms felt clammy against the bike handles. He slowed his pedaling, squinting as he approached. A man dressed in a sharp black suit stood outside the car. He was looking at Tommy's house, and something about his posture made Tommy nervous. He got closer, trying to see what was happening. He saw the man pull something out of his pocket, a notepad maybe, and he wrote something down before glancing up at the house again. Tommy's heart pounded faster. He knew trouble when he saw it, and this had trouble written all over it. He stopped his bike a few houses down, keeping an eye on the man. The stranger turned, catching sight of Tommy, and for a second, their eyes locked. Tommy quickly looked away, pretending to fiddle with his bike chain. His hands trembled as he adjusted the chain, his head spinning with thoughts. Why was this man here? Was it about the notice? Was it because of the cables he'd helped with? The man walked back towards the car, and Tommy stole a glance at him. He looked serious, too serious for a morning like this. Tommy watched as he opened the car door, pausing before getting in, like he was waiting for something. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. Then suddenly the man spoke up, his voice loud enough to echo across the street. "Is there a Tommy here?" He looked directly at the house, and Tommy felt his stomach drop. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. Should he answer? Should he hide? He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He felt an urge to protect his mom, keep her out of whatever this was. But the man kept looking, waiting. Tommy stood up straight, gripping his bike's handlebars tightly. He forced himself to take a step forward. "Yeah," he called out, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Yeah, I'm Tommy." The man's gaze shifted to him, and Tommy's heart pounded against his ribs. The man nodded and motioned him over. Tommy hesitated, glancing towards the house, wondering if his mom was watching. But he knew he couldn't run. He couldn't let whatever this was just happen to them without facing it. Slowly, he walked his bike over to the car, his legs trembling as he got closer. The man gave him a tight-lipped smile, though it didn't seem entirely friendly. "Tommy, right?" the man asked, looking him up and down. "You helped Mr. Thomas yesterday?" Tommy nodded, still gripping his bike like it was a shield. "Yeah, I did. Why?" The man glanced at his notepad, flipping through a few pages. He didn't answer right away, and Tommy felt the knot in his stomach tighten. The man finally spoke, his voice calm but formal. "Mr. Thomas told us about what happened. He mentioned you helped him out, even when things got a little heated with some folks." He raised an eyebrow as if to see Tommy's reaction. Tommy swallowed hard. "Yeah, I helped him. Is that a problem?" He tried to keep his voice steady, though his insides felt shaky. The man looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Not a problem, no. But we'd like to talk to your guardian. Your mom, I assume." Tommy's heart sank. He shook his head instinctively. "She's not home right now. She's working." His voice came out sharper than he intended, defensive. The man sighed, glancing back at the car. "Look, I just need to talk to her about some things. Can you tell her that?" He pulled out a card, handing it to Tommy. Tommy stared at the card for a second before taking it, his fingers trembling, as he looked down at the name and phone number printed on it. It was some sort of company card, a name he didn't recognize. "Tell her to give me a call, all right? It's important," the man said. His voice softened a bit, as if he noticed Tommy's nerves. "It's nothing bad, kid. Just tell her to call me." Tommy nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. The man gave him another curt nod before getting into the car. He started the engine, and Tommy stepped back, watching as the car pulled away. He stood there for a long time after it left, staring at the card in his hand. He didn't know what to think. He turned it over, looking at the contact details again, trying to understand. He didn't know if this was good news or bad news. All he knew was that it felt heavy. Slowly, he walked his bike back up to the house, slipping the card into his pocket. He had to wait for his mom to get home before he could tell her, and he had no idea how she would react to this. He pushed open the door and let his bike fall against the wall. His little brother Jordan was playing with some blocks on the floor. Jordan looked up, smiling when he saw Tommy. "Tommy, come help me build," Jordan called, but Tommy shook his head, trying to muster a smile. "Not right now, buddy," he said quietly. I need to think about some stuff." Jordan pouted but went back to his blocks, and Tommy walked into the kitchen. He could still see the eviction notice on the counter, staring at him like an uninvited guest. He took out the card, setting it down next to the notice. The two pieces of paper sat side by side, one a reminder of their problems, the other an unknown. Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that, one way or another, these two things were connected. His mom came home later that afternoon, looking worn out as usual. She dropped her bag by the door and looked around the small apartment, her eyes landing on Tommy. He was sitting at the kitchen table, the card in his hand. "Tommy?" she asked, her voice tired. "What's that?" Tommy hesitated, then held out the card. "A guy came by today. He was in a black car. Said he needed to talk to you about something." His mom frowned, taking the card. She turned it over, reading it, and her eyes narrowed. "What did he say?" Tommy shifted in his seat. "He said it was about Mr. Thomas, the work I helped him with yesterday. I don't know, Mom. He said it wasn't anything bad, but..." She sighed, setting the card down. I swear, if this is more trouble. Her voice trailed off and she shook her head, sitting down heavily in the chair across from Tommy. She looked at the card, then at the eviction notice beside it. Her shoulders sagged, and she let out a long breath. "All right," she said finally. "I'll call him tomorrow, but Tommy, I need you to stay out of this. No more getting involved in stuff, you understand me? You don't need to be mixed up in any of this." Tommy nodded, though he didn't say anything. He didn't know if he could promise that. Not when things felt like they were spiraling, and he needed to do something to keep them together. His mom got up, running her hand through his hair as she passed. "I just need you to be safe, Tommy. Let me handle this." He watched her go, the weight of the day still heavy on his chest. He looked at the card on the table again, the man's name staring up at him. He knew things were changing. He just didn't know if it was for better or worse. The next morning, Tommy watched his mom pace the kitchen. She had the card in her hand, her fingers tapping it nervously against her thigh. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. She hadn't slept much. Tommy could hear her moving around the apartment late into the night. He had barely slept himself, waiting for what was going to happen next. She finally stopped pacing and looked at him. "I'm going to call this guy," she said, her voice firm. "I want you to stay here with your brother and sister. Just stay put, okay?" Tommy nodded. "Yeah, I'll watch them." She went to the small corner of the living room, the closest thing they had to a private space, and pulled out her phone. Tommy could hear the beeping as she dialed, and he strained to hear her conversation over the noise of Jordan and Maya playing. His mom spoke quietly at first, but as the conversation continued, her voice grew louder, more anxious. "What do you mean, an offer? What's this about?" she said, her voice carrying through the small apartment. Tommy's heart skipped a beat. He moved closer, trying to catch more of the words. His mom was listening now, and then she suddenly let out a sharp breath. "A scholarship," she said, her voice cracking a little. She sounded confused, like she didn't quite believe what she was hearing. Tommy stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. Scholarship? He glanced over at his siblings, who were oblivious to the tension, and then looked back at his mom. She was rubbing her forehead, her eyes closed as she listened to whatever the man was saying on the other end. Okay, I get it," she said finally. Her voice was softer now, and she sounded almost relieved. "We'll talk about it. Yeah, thank you." She hung up the phone, letting out a shaky breath. She stood there for a moment, staring at the wall before turning back to Tommy. He watched her, his chest tight, waiting for her to say something. "Tommy," she said quietly, "come here." He walked over, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, relief, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite place. "What did he say?" Tommy asked, his voice barely a whisper. She shook her head, a small disbelieving smile tugging at her lips. "He said they want to give you a scholarship, some kind of support for helping that man, Mr. Thomas, with the work you did." Tommy blinked, the words not quite sinking in. "A scholarship? For me?" His mom nodded, her eyes starting to well up. "And some money, too. They're offering $5,000. She stopped, taking a deep breath, trying to collect herself. "It's not enough to fix everything, but it's something, Tommy. It's a chance. For you. For us." Tommy's heart pounded in his chest. $5,000. It wasn't enough to solve all their problems, but it was something. It was hope. His mom pulled him into a hug, her arms tight around him. He could feel her shaking, her breath hitching as she tried to hold back her tears. He hugged her back, his own eyes stinging. "Why?" he asked, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Why would they do that?" She pulled back, looking at him, her eyes filled with pride. "Because you helped, Tommy. You did something good and someone noticed." Tommy swallowed hard, his throat tight. He didn't know what to say. He had just wanted to help, to make himself useful. He hadn't expected anything in return, especially not something like this. His mom cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You did good, Tommy." He nodded, his eyes still wet. He could barely find his voice. "Yeah, I just wanted to help." The rest of the day passed in a blur. His mom called into her job saying she wouldn't be able to make it that day, and she spent the afternoon filling out forms and making more phone calls, trying to sort out the details. Tommy stayed in the background, watching her move with a new energy. For the first time in a long while, she didn't look quite as tired. He took his siblings out to the small patch of grass behind their building, letting Jordan run around, while he kept Maya entertained. He couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. It felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, but there was still a part of him that felt uneasy, like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Later that evening, as they sat down to dinner, his mom seemed lighter, her smile more genuine. She looked at Tommy, her eyes full of warmth. "I talked to the man again," she said, setting her fork down. "He said they're going to send someone over in the next few days to finalize everything. They want to make sure we're taken care of, Tommy. This could change things for us." Tommy nodded, his heart pounding. "So, we won't have to leave?" His mom shook her head, her smile widening. "I don't think so, baby. I think we're going to be all right." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Jordan looked up from his food, his face scrunching up in confusion. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice loud in the small kitchen. His mom laughed, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "Good things, baby. Good things are happening." Tommy smiled, his chest feeling a little lighter. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of hope in the apartment. He looked at his mom, seeing the relief in her face, and felt something shift inside him. Maybe things really could get better. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Tommy lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the soft whir of the old ceiling fan above him. He couldn't sleep, his mind too full of everything that had happened. The black car, the man in the suit, the scholarship, everything felt like a dream. He got up quietly, careful not to wake Jordan, who was snoring softly in the bed next to his. He walked over to the window, pushing aside the thin curtain to look out at the street below. The world outside was dark and still, the streetlights casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. He thought about Mr. Thomas, about the way he had smiled and thanked him for helping. He hadn't expected anything from that. He had just wanted to do something good. But somehow, it had led to this, a chance to change everything for his family. He took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. He knew things weren't going to be perfect, that there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe they had a shot. Maybe they could make it. He let the curtain fall back into place, turning away from the window. He crawled back into bed, pulling the blanket up to his chin. He closed his eyes, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope. The next morning, Tommy woke up to the smell of breakfast cooking. He blinked, confused for a moment. It was rare for his mom to have the time to make a real breakfast. He pulled himself out of bed, careful not to wake Jordan, and tiptoed out of the room. As he stepped into the kitchen, he found his mom at the stove, flipping pancakes. She looked more relaxed than he had seen her in a long time, her shoulders no longer slumped in exhaustion. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said, glancing back at him with a smile. "I thought I'd make us something special today." Tommy rubbed his eyes, still feeling the sleepiness hang on. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, glancing at the stack of pancakes she had already made. "Smells good." She gave him a bright smile, turning her attention back to the skillet. I figured we all needed a bit of good news and a nice start to the day, don't you think? Tommy nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. Things really did feel different. There was still the worry of the eviction notice, still so much to figure out, but the feeling of hope in the air was something new, something he hadn't realized just how much he'd needed. Jordan stumbled into the kitchen a moment later, his hair sticking out in every direction. He rubbed his eyes, looking around before his face lit up at the sight of pancakes. "Whoa, we got pancakes?" he said, rushing over to the table. His mom laughed, flipping the last one onto the stack and turning off the stove. "Yes, we do. Go ahead, sit down." Jordan scrambled into his chair and Maya babbled from her high chair, her little hands waving in excitement. Tommy helped her settle down while his mom brought the plates over. They all sat down, and for a moment the apartment felt lighter, like all the weight they had been carrying had been lifted. As they ate, Tommy's mom looked over at him, her eyes soft. "You know, Tommy," she said, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking a lot. What you did for Mr. Thomas, it showed me just how strong you are. You stepped up when we needed it, and I'm so proud of you." Tommy looked down at his plate, his ears burning a little. He didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded, taking another bite of his pancake. She smiled, reaching over to touch his hand. "This scholarship, this chance, it's because of what you did. And now, it's up to us to make the most of it." Tommy nodded again, feeling that familiar tightness in his chest. But this time, it wasn't the same kind of pressure. It felt different, like the kind of pressure that pushed him to do better, to be better. "Yeah, I'll make it count, Mom," he said finally, looking up at her. "I promise." Later that day, Tommy went back to school. It felt strange walking through the halls, knowing what had happened. He kept his head down, trying to stay out of the way. He didn't know if anyone else knew about the scholarship or the money. They hadn't told anyone except Mrs. Jenkins, and he wanted to keep it that way. He walked into his math class, slipping into his seat quietly. He opened his notebook, his mind still focused on everything that was happening at home. The teacher, Mr. Cooper, started the lesson, his voice droning on about equations and variables. Tommy tried to focus, but his mind kept wandering back to the scholarship, to the chance he had now. He needed to make this work. He couldn't let his mom down. As the class ended, Mr. Cooper called out, "Tommy, can I see you for a moment?" Tommy froze, his heart skipping a beat. He looked around, seeing his classmates file out, some of them glancing his way. He swallowed hard, getting up from his seat and walking over to the teacher's desk. Mr. Cooper looked up, giving him a small smile. "Tommy, I just wanted to congratulate you. I heard about the scholarship." Tommy blinked, his throat suddenly dry. Thanks," he mumbled. Mr. Cooper nodded. "It's a big opportunity. Not a lot of kids get something like that. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. It's not easy to get noticed like that." Tommy shifted on his feet, his hands in his pockets. "Thanks, Mr. Cooper," he said again, not sure what else to say. The teacher gave him another smile before turning back to his papers. "Keep up the good work, all right? I know you've got a lot on your plate, but you've got potential, Tommy. Don't waste it." Tommy nodded, his face feeling hot. "Yeah, I'll do my best." He turned and walked out of the classroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected anyone to know, but hearing Mr. Cooper say he was proud made something stir inside him, something that felt like a mix of pride and fear. He had never been the type to stand out, and now people were watching him. He had to live up to their expectations. When he got home that afternoon, his mom was sitting at the kitchen table, filling out more paperwork. She looked up as he walked in, giving him a tired smile. "How was school?" she asked, setting her pen down. Tommy shrugged, dropping his backpack on the floor. "It was all right. Mr. Cooper said he heard about the scholarship. She raised an eyebrow, her smile widening a little. He did, huh? Well, that's good. Means people are noticing you, Tommy. That's not a bad thing. Tommy nodded, though he wasn't sure how he felt about it. He walked over and sat down across from her, glancing at the papers spread out on the table. There were forms, documents, things he didn't quite understand. What's all this? He asked, picking up one of the papers. His mom sighed, running a hand through her hair. Just some things I need to sort out for the scholarship. They need proof of income and some other details. It's a lot, but it's worth it. Tommy looked at her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the determination. She was fighting for this, fighting for him. He felt a pang of guilt for all the times he had thought about giving up, for all the times he had wanted to quit school and find work. Mom, he said quietly, his voice trembling a little. I'm going to make this work. I promise. I'll do whatever it takes. She looked at him, her eyes softening. She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. I know you will, Tommy. I know you will. The next morning, Tommy woke up early. He had decided that if he was going to make the most of this opportunity, he needed to put in the effort. He grabbed his school books and sat at the kitchen table, studying before his siblings woke up. He went over his math problems, scribbling notes in his notebook, his mind focused on the numbers in front of him. His mom walked in a little while later, stopping in the doorway when she saw him. She smiled, her eyes filled with pride. Look at you, already working hard, she said softly. Tommy looked up, giving her a small smile. Just trying to make it count, Mom. She nodded, walking over to kiss his head. You're doing great, baby. Keep it up. As the sun rose higher, the rest of the family woke up, and the small apartment filled with the usual morning chaos. But through it all, Tommy felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. He knew things wouldn't be easy, that they still had a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were heading in the right direction. As he left for school, he looked back at his mom, who was standing by the door, her smile warm and hopeful. He waved, and she waved back, her eyes filled with the kind of pride that made his chest swell. He walked down the street, his backpack heavy on his shoulders, but the weight didn't feel so bad anymore. It felt like something he could carry, something he was willing to carry, for his mom, for his siblings, for himself. He knew there would still be challenges, still be moments where things got hard, but he was ready for it. He was ready to face whatever came next, one step at a time. Tommy came home from school one afternoon, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and immediately noticed something different. The apartment felt less rushed, less heavy. The usual tension, the strain of worrying about bills, rent, and what was coming next, seemed to be dialed down. It wasn't gone, but it had definitely lightened. Tommy, is that you? His mom called out from the kitchen. Yeah, it's me, Tommy said, dropping his backpack on the floor. His mom walked into the living room, a smile on her face that looked almost relaxed. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen her look that way. She had a dish towel draped over her shoulder, and her hair was tied back loosely. Her eyes didn't have that tired, hollow look for once. Guess what? She said, her voice almost teasing. I'm only working one shift today. Tommy blinked. Really? She nodded. Yep. That scholarship money, well, it's helping more than just your school. It's letting me cut back a little on my hours. Means I get to be home more. Means we get to have dinner together again, instead of you kids eating without me all the time. Tommy smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. That's awesome, Mom. She reached out, ruffling his hair like she used to when he was little. It is, isn't it? Now why don't you go change, and we'll get dinner started. Tommy headed to his room, the smile still on his face. It felt good, knowing that all the hard work and worry were starting to pay off, Not just for him, but for all of them. That night they had dinner together as a family for the first time in what felt like forever. The table was small, the chairs a little worn, but the laughter that filled the room was something Tommy hadn't heard in a long time. Jordan was telling a story about school, something about a new kid who had brought a frog to class, and his mom was laughing, her eyes shining. Maya clapped her hands, mimicking the laughter, even though she had no idea what they were laughing about. Her smile was big and bright, and her giggles made everyone else laugh even harder. Tommy looked around the table at his family and felt a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect. There were still a lot of things they had to figure out. But this felt like a step in the right direction. After dinner, Tommy helped his mom with the dishes while Jordan and Maya played in the living room. She handed him a wet plate, and he dried it carefully, placing it in the cabinet above. "You know," his mom said, her voice quiet, "I think we're going to be okay, Tommy, I really do." He looked at her, seeing the hope in her eyes. He nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, I think so too, Mom." She smiled, bumping her shoulder gently against his. "And it's because of you, you know. You gave us a chance." Tommy didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest. He had always wanted to help, to make things better for his family, and now it felt like maybe he was finally doing that. A few days later, Tommy was in the middle of his homework when the phone rang. His mom picked it up, her face lighting up when she saw who it was. "It's Mr. Thomas," she mouthed to Tommy, holding the phone to her ear. She walked into the other room, talking in a low voice. Tommy strained to hear, curious. After a few minutes, his mom walked back in, her face looking pleased. "Mr. Thomas wants you to come by and see him," she said, setting the phone down. "He said he has something to show you." He sounded excited. Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Really? What does he want?" She shrugged, smiling. "Guess you'll have to go see." The next day after school, Tommy rode his bike over to where Mr. Thomas worked. The cables were gone now, the work completed, but Tommy spotted Mr. Thomas near one of the trucks. He looked up and waved as Tommy approached. "Tommy, just the guy I wanted to see," Mr. Thomas said, a broad smile on his face. Tommy hopped off his bike, leaning it against a nearby pole. "Hey, Mr. Thomas, my mom said you wanted to see me." Mr. Thomas nodded, motioning for Tommy to follow him. He led him around to the back of the truck where there was a bunch of tools and equipment. He picked up a hard hat and handed it to Tommy. "You did a great job helping me the other day," Mr. Thomas said. "And I figured maybe you'd like to see more of what we do around here. I talked to my boss, and he said it's fine if you want to tag along sometimes. You know, just to learn." Tommy's eyes widened, and he looked down at the hard hat in his hands. "You mean I can come help?" "Not working exactly," Mr. Thomas said, smiling. "But you can watch, learn a few things. You've got a good head on your shoulders, kid. Figured it might be good for you to see what's out there." Tommy felt his chest swell with excitement. He had always wanted to do more, to learn more, and now Mr. Thomas was giving him a chance to do that. "Thanks, Mr. Thomas," Tommy said, his voice a little shaky. "I'd really like that." Mr. Thomas patted him on the shoulder. "No problem, kid. You deserve it." That evening, when Tommy got home, his mom was waiting for him. She looked a little nervous, her eyes darting to the door as he walked in. "How'd it go with Mr. Thomas?" she asked, her voice cautious. Tommy grinned, holding up the hard hat. "He said I can come watch them work sometimes, learn a few things. Isn't that cool?" His mom's eyes widened and she let out a breath. "Really? That's amazing, Tommy." She walked over, hugging him tightly. "You're really doing it, aren't you?" she whispered. "You're making a better life for yourself." Tommy hugged her back, feeling the weight of her words. He didn't know if he was making a better life, not yet. But he was trying, and that was all he could do. A week later, Tommy found himself standing next to Mr. Thomas, watching as the crew worked on installing more cables. He wore the hard hat Mr. Thomas had given him, and though he wasn't allowed to do much, just being there felt like something. He watched the men work, listened as Mr. Thomas explained what they were doing, and felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. He wasn't just a kid sitting around, waiting for things to get better. He was out here learning, helping when he could, and trying to make something of himself, and that felt good. One of the other workers walked over, giving Tommy a nod. "You the kid who helped out last time?" he asked. Tommy nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah, that was me." The man smiled. "You did good, kid. We could use more people like you out here." Tommy felt his face flush with pride. "Thanks." Mr. Thomas gave him a wink, patting his back. "Told you, kid. You got a bright future ahead of you." When Tommy got home that day, he felt different. He felt like he was finally making progress, like he was moving in the right direction. He walked into the apartment and his mom looked up, a smile on her face. "How'd it go?" she asked. Tommy grinned, dropping his bag on the floor. "It was great. I think I really learned a lot today." She nodded, her eyes filled with pride. "That's my boy." As the evening wore on and the sun began to set, Tommy sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. He knew there were still challenges ahead. There was still so much they had to figure out. But for the first time, he felt like he had a real chance. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was growing, learning, and making things better for himself and his family. And that was worth everything. The sun hung low in the sky as Tommy stood outside the cable installation truck, adjusting the hard hat on his head. The crew was gearing up for another day of work, and Tommy felt the familiar mix of excitement and nerves. He was just supposed to watch and learn, but being here made him feel like he was part of something bigger. It made him feel like he was building something, not just for himself, but for his family too. "All right, kid, you ready to see some real work today?" Mr. Thomas called out, his voice booming as he approached with a grin on his face. Tommy nodded. "I'm ready," he said, giving a small but determined smile. Mr. Thomas handed him a pair of gloves. "You won't be doing the heavy lifting, but you can help out a bit more today. Just stick close to me and keep your ears open." Tommy's heart swelled with pride. He pulled the gloves on, feeling the rough material stretch over his fingers. The gloves made him feel like he was really part of the team. The crew got to work, pulling cables, climbing ladders, and securing the wires along the lines. Tommy watched everything closely, his eyes darting from worker to worker, memorizing the movements. He listened as Mr. Thomas explained the steps, how everything needed to be secured just right, how a mistake could lead to power outages or worse. There was a sense of purpose here that Tommy hadn't felt anywhere else. It wasn't like school, where he struggled to stay focused, or at home, where everything was uncertain. Out here, there was work to do, and everyone relied on each other to get it done. There was a sense of belonging. "Hey, Tommy," one of the crew members, a younger guy named Dave, called out. "Grab that spool over there, would you?" Tommy hurried over, grabbing the heavy spool of cable. It was bigger than he expected, and he struggled to lift it. His arms strained, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to give up. Mr. Thomas glanced over, giving him a nod of encouragement. "Take your time, kid. No rush." Tommy managed to lift the spool, carrying it over to where Dave stood. He set it down, his muscles aching, but the smile on Dave's face made it worth it. "Thanks, man," Dave said, giving him a clap on the back. "You're doing great." Tommy beamed, the ache in his arms forgotten. He looked around, seeing the crew moving with purpose, and he felt a swell of pride. He was part of this. He was helping. By lunchtime, the crew took a break, gathering around the truck to eat. Mr. Thomas handed Tommy a sandwich, and they sat on the curb, watching the traffic pass by. "You're doing good out here, Tommy," Mr. Thomas said between bites. "You remind me of myself when I was your age. eager to learn, willing to work hard. Tommy looked down at his sandwich, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Thanks, Mr. Thomas. I like being here. It feels good, you know? Mr. Thomas nodded, his eyes softening. I get it, kid. There's something about working with your hands, building something, that makes you feel useful, like you're making a difference. Tommy nodded. Yeah, that's exactly it. Mr. Thomas smiled, clapping a hand on Tommy's shoulder. Just keep at it, all right? You've got a lot of potential. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Tommy looked at him, his throat tightening. No one had ever said that to him before, at least not like this. Not in a way that felt real. He swallowed hard, nodding. I won't. I promise. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly, and soon enough the crew was packing up for the day. Tommy helped load the equipment back into the truck, his muscles sore, but his heart full. He could see the sun setting in the distance, the sky painted with oranges and purples. All right, kid. That's a wrap, Mr. Thomas said, wiping the sweat from his brow. You did good today. Tommy grinned, taking off the hard hat and handing it back. Thanks, Mr. Thomas. I really appreciate you letting me come out here. Mr. Thomas waved a hand. Anytime, Tommy. You're always welcome. Just remember, hard work pays off even if it doesn't seem like it at first. Tommy nodded, the words sinking in. Hard work pays off. He knew that better than anyone now. He had seen how just a little bit of effort, a little bit of courage, could make a big difference. He got on his bike, waving to the crew as they drove off, and started heading home. The air was cool now, the heat of the day fading as the sun dipped below the horizon. He pedaled slowly, taking his time, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. He turned the corner onto his street, and as he approached his building, he saw someone he recognized. The security guard from the neighborhood, the one who had confronted him that day he helped Mr. Thomas, was standing near the front of his building. Tommy's chest tightened, his hands gripping the handlebars a little harder. The guard noticed Tommy and nodded, his expression different from the last time they'd seen each other. There was no suspicion in his eyes this time, just acknowledgement. He even gave a small wave. Tommy stopped, his bike skidding slightly. He hesitated, then lifted a hand in return. The guard walked over, his posture more relaxed. Hey there, kid, the guard said. I heard about what you did. Helping out with the cables, the scholarship. Good on you. Tommy blinked, surprised. Thanks, he said, unsure of what else to say. The guard nodded. I guess I might have judged you a little too quickly last time. It's good to see you're doing well. Keep it up. Tommy nodded, his chest loosening a little. I will. The guard gave him a small smile, then turned and walked away, leaving Tommy standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't much, but it felt like a step forward, like maybe not everyone in this neighborhood saw him as trouble. He pushed his bike towards the building, his mind still reeling from the encounter. He walked inside, his mom greeting him as he stepped through the door. How was it today? She asked, her eyes filled with curiosity. Tommy smiled, setting his bike against the wall. It was great, Mom. Mr. Thomas let me help out a bit more and... He paused, glancing back at the door. I talked to that security guard from the neighborhood. He said he heard about the scholarship. He said I'm doing good. His mom's eyes widened, her mouth dropping open a little. Really? Tommy nodded. Yeah. I think maybe things are starting to change. People are noticing. She reached out, pulling him into a hug. I'm so proud of you, Tommy. You're proving to everyone just how good you are. Tommy hugged her back, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He had always wanted to be seen, to be noticed for the right reasons. And now it felt like maybe that was finally happening. That night, Tommy sat on the fire escape, staring out at the darkened street below. The city lights flickered, casting a soft glow over the buildings. He thought about everything that had happened. The scholarship, the chance Mr. Thomas had given him, the words from the security guard. It was all more than he could have ever imagined. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. He knew things weren't perfect. There were still challenges ahead, still so much to prove. But he was ready. He was ready to keep working, to keep fighting for a better future. He looked up at the stars, the tiny specks of light dotting the dark sky, and smiled. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. Tommy woke up to the sound of Jordan whispering excitedly in his ear. He blinked groggily, pushing himself up on one elbow to see his little brother standing beside his bed, his face lit with anticipation. "Tommy, Mom said we're all having breakfast together again today. She's cooking eggs and toast," Jordan said, practically bouncing on his feet. Tommy smiled, yawning as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. "Yeah? All right, let's go then." Jordan rushed ahead of him into the kitchen, where the smell of eggs cooking filled the air. Their mom was at the stove, her hair tied back, a bright smile on her face as she glanced over her shoulder at her kids. She looked like she had energy, like the rest was starting to catch up with her. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said to Tommy, raising an eyebrow as he shuffled in. "Morning, Mom," Tommy mumbled, sitting down at the table. Maya was already there, tapping her small hands on the surface, her eyes fixed on the stove. Tommy reached over, making funny faces at her, and she giggled, her tiny laugh filling the room. His mom served the eggs and toast, placing plates in front of them. Jordan was quick to dig in, but Tommy noticed his mom watching him, her eyes soft. He gave her a questioning look. "Something up, Mom?" he asked, taking a bite of his toast. She smiled, her eyes glistening a little. "No, nothing's wrong. I was just thinking about how far we've come. Things feel different now, don't they?" Tommy nodded. He knew exactly what she meant. The fear of eviction wasn't looming over them like it used to, and there was a sense of stability that they hadn't had in a long time. Things were still tough, but there was hope now. There was a direction. "Yeah, they do," Tommy said, smiling at her. "We're getting there." She reached over, squeezing his hand. "We are. And I'm so proud of you, Tommy. You're making it happen for all of us." Tommy swallowed, his throat tightening. He didn't always feel like he was doing enough, but the way his mom looked at him now, the pride in her eyes, it made it all worth it. He nodded, not trusting his voice enough to speak. Later that morning after breakfast, Tommy's mom pulled him aside while Jordan and Maya played in the living room. She had a serious look on her face, though her eyes were still kind. "Tommy, I've been thinking," she said, leaning against the counter. "Now that things are a little more stable, I want you to start thinking about what you want to do. I mean, long term. You've got this scholarship now. You can do something big." Tommy blinked, taken aback. I don't know, Mom. I mean, I like working with Mr. Thomas and all, but..." She nodded, understanding. "I know it's a lot to think about. But you're smart, Tommy. You're capable of so much more than just what's right in front of you. I want you to dream big, all right? I want you to think about what you really want." Tommy looked down at the floor, her words sinking in. He had always just been focused on getting by, on making sure his family was okay. But now she was asking him to look further, to see a future that was more than just surviving. "I'll think about it, Mom," he said quietly. She smiled, pulling him into a hug. "That's all I'm asking. Just think about it." The next week, Tommy started going to a few extra classes after school, part of the scholarship support program. They were classes meant to help kids get ready for college, or at least think about it as an option. Tommy wasn't sure what he wanted yet, but he figured it couldn't hurt to go. He walked into the small classroom after school, glancing around nervously. There were a few other kids there, some he recognized from around school, others he didn't know. They were all sitting in desks, talking in low voices. Tommy found a seat in the back, keeping his head down. A woman walked in a moment later, her smile warm as she set her bag down on the desk at the front of the room. She looked around at the students, her eyes landing on Tommy for a moment. She gave him an encouraging smile. "Hello, everyone. My name is Mrs. Reyes, and I'm here to help you figure out what you want to do after high school. College, jobs, whatever it is, you've all got potential, and we're going to explore that." Tommy shifted in his seat, feeling a little out of place. He had never really thought about college. It seemed like something other people did, people who had the money for it, or who didn't have to worry about where they were going to live. But now, maybe it was something he could do too. Maybe. Mrs. Reyes talked about different options, about how to figure out what you were interested in, and about scholarships that could help pay for college. Tommy listened quietly, taking notes, though he still felt uncertain. He wasn't sure if this was for him, but he knew he couldn't give up. Not after everything his family had been through. At the end of the class, Mrs. Reyes walked over to him as he packed up his notebook. "Tommy, right?" she asked, her voice kind. He looked up, nodding. "Yeah," she smiled. "I heard about your scholarship. That's a big deal, you know. You should be proud." Tommy shrugged, feeling his face heat up. "Yeah, I guess." She tilted her head, her eyes searching his. "You ever thought about what you want to do after high school?" Tommy hesitated. "Not really. I mean, I'm just trying to help my family right now." Mrs. Reyes nodded, her smile softening. "That's admirable, Tommy. But you should know, it's okay to want something for yourself too. You've got potential. Don't be afraid to dream a little." Tommy nodded, her words echoing what his mom had said. He wasn't sure if he knew how to dream big, but maybe it was something he could learn. After the class, Tommy rode his bike over to Mr. Thomas's work site. The crew was wrapping up for the day, and Mr. Thomas waved when he saw Tommy approaching. "Hey, kid, you're just in time to see us finish up," Mr. Thomas called, his voice carrying over the noise of the crew. Tommy smiled, hopping off his bike and walking over. He watched as the workers secured the last of the cables, their movements efficient and practiced. He felt a sense of satisfaction watching them work, knowing he was part of this now, even in a small way. Mr. Thomas walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "How's school going, Tommy?" Tommy shrugged. "It's going all right. I'm taking some extra classes now, you know, for college and stuff." Mr. Thomas raised an eyebrow, his eyes lighting up. "College, huh? That's a big step. You thinking about going?" Tommy looked down, kicking at the dirt with his shoe. "I don't know. I mean, maybe. Everyone keeps telling me I should think about it." Mr. Thomas nodded, his smile gentle. "Well, they're right. You've got a lot of potential, kid. You're smart and you work hard. College could be a good thing for you." Tommy looked up at him, his chest tightening. "Yeah, but I don't even know what I'd do. I mean, I like this. Working with my hands, I don't know if I'm cut out for college." Mr. Thomas put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to decide right now, but just know, you're capable of more than you think. Whatever you choose, I know you'll do great." Tommy swallowed, nodding. "Thanks, Mr. Thomas." Mr. Thomas smiled, giving his shoulder a squeeze. "Anytime, kid. Just keep your options open, all right?" That night, Tommy sat in his room staring at his notebook. He had written down some of the things Mrs. Reyes had talked about, different careers, different paths he could take. He didn't know if college was for him, but he couldn't help but think about what Mr. Thomas and his mom had said. He thought about his family, about everything they had been through, and about the future. He wanted to be able to take care of them, to make sure they never had to worry about rent or bills again. And maybe college was a way to do that. Maybe it was a way to build something better for all of them. He took a deep breath, picking up his pen and writing at the top of the page, "Dream big." He didn't know what his dream was yet, but he was willing to find out. he was willing to try. Tommy stood in front of the classroom, his palms sweaty as he looked out at the faces of his classmates and a few parents who were seated in the back. He could see his mom, her eyes bright with encouragement, and Jordan sitting beside her, fidgeting in his seat. Mrs. Reyes stood off to the side, giving him an encouraging nod. Tommy took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He was about to give a small speech. A part of the scholarship program was about sharing his experience, what he had learned, and how it had changed him. He hadn't wanted to do it. He didn't like the idea of being the center of attention, of standing in front of everyone with all eyes on him. But Mrs. Reyes had convinced him that this was a part of his journey, a chance to show how far he had come, not just to himself, but to others who might be struggling too. Tommy cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he started. Hi everyone, my name's Tommy. I'm here to talk a little bit about what this scholarship means to me. He paused, glancing down at his notes, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked back up at the audience, his eyes catching his mom's. She smiled at him, and it gave him the courage to keep going. When I first heard about this scholarship, I didn't really understand why they picked me, Tommy said, his voice gaining a little strength. I was just a kid trying to help out, trying to do something good for my family. I didn't think that something so small could lead to something like this. He glanced at Mr. Thomas, who was also there, sitting near the back. Mr. Thomas gave him a thumbs up, and Tommy felt a smile pull at his lips. I guess what I've learned is that even small actions can make a big difference, Tommy continued. I helped someone move some cables, and it turned into something bigger than I could have imagined. It gave me a chance, not just for me, but for my family too. It showed me that maybe I could do more than just get by. He looked down at his notes, then back up, his eyes scanning the room. I think we all have moments where we feel like what we do doesn't matter, or like we're stuck. I know I felt that way, but this has taught me that sometimes all it takes is one step, one small action, to start changing everything. Tommy paused, his throat tightening as he looked at his mom again. She was nodding, her eyes glistening. Jordan was watching him with wide eyes, and Maya, on his mom's lap, was babbling happily, oblivious to the attention on her brother. I'm not sure what my dream is yet, Tommy said, his voice softer. But I know I want to make my family proud. I want to build something better for us. And I think that's enough for now. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, and gave a small, nervous smile. Thank you to everyone who's helped me. My mom, Mr. Thomas, Mrs. Reyes, you all believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. And I'm going to keep working, keep trying, because of you. There was a moment of silence, and then the room broke into applause. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest, his face flushing as he looked around. He saw his mom standing, clapping, her eyes filled with tears. Mr. Thomas was smiling broadly, and Mrs. Reyes gave him a proud nod. Tommy stepped back from the podium, feeling a rush of relief and something else, something that felt a lot like pride. He walked off to the side where his mom pulled him into a hug, her arms tight around him. You did amazing, Tommy, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so proud of you. Tommy hugged her back, his eyes stinging. Thanks, Mom. Jordan tugged on his sleeve, looking up at him. You're a hero, Tommy. You're like really cool. Tommy laughed, ruffling Jordan's hair. Thanks, buddy. Mr. Thomas approached, giving Tommy a pat on the back. You did great, kid. I told you, you've got something special. Tommy looked up at him, nodding. Thanks, Mr. Thomas. I couldn't have done it without you. Mr. Thomas smiled. Well, you did the hard work. I just helped you along the way. A few days later, Tommy was back in his routine. School, the scholarship classes, and sometimes helping out at Mr. Thomas's work site. But things felt different now. There was a lightness in the air that hadn't been there before, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were going to keep getting better. One afternoon after school, Tommy rode his bike to Mr. Thomas's work site. He wasn't scheduled to be there, but he wanted to stop by. He liked being around the crew. They treated him like he was one of them, and it made him feel like he belonged. As he arrived, he saw Mr. Thomas standing by the truck, talking with a few of the other workers. Mr. Thomas waved when he saw Tommy, motioning for him to come over. "Hey, kid, what brings you by today?" Mr. Thomas asked, a smile on his face. Tommy shrugged, smiling. "Just wanted to see if you needed any help." Mr. Thomas laughed, shaking his head. "Always eager, huh? Well, we're just finishing up, but you can give us a hand with the cleanup." Tommy nodded, grabbing a pair of gloves from the truck and getting to work. He helped coil up some cables, his hands moving quickly and efficiently. The crew worked alongside him, their banter and laughter filling the air. It felt good, like he was part of something that mattered. When they were done, Mr. Thomas walked over, leaning against the truck. "You know, Tommy, I've been thinking. You've got a good head for this kind of work. Ever think about doing this for real as a career?" Tommy looked at him, surprised. "You mean, like, a job?" Mr. Thomas nodded. "Yeah. You're young, but you're smart, and you've got a good work ethic. You stick with it, and I think you could go far. Maybe even get into electrical work or something like that. It's good, honest work, and it pays well." Tommy thought about it, his heart pounding a little. He had always liked working with his hands, being part of something tangible. It wasn't college, but it was something he could see himself doing, something that could give him a stable future. "I'll think about it, Mr. Thomas," Tommy said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks." Mr. Thomas patted his shoulder. "You do that, kid. And whatever you decide, just remember, you've got people in your corner. You're not alone." Tommy nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He wasn't alone. He had his mom, his siblings, Mr. Thomas, Mrs. Reyes, and so many others who believed in him. And that made all the difference. That night, Tommy sat on the fire escape, looking out at the city lights. The breeze was cool against his skin, and he could hear the faint sounds of traffic in the distance. He thought about everything that had happened, the scholarship, the speech, the work with Mr. Thomas. He thought about his mom and the way her eyes had filled with pride when she looked at him. He didn't know exactly what the future held. He didn't know if he'd end up going to college or if he'd work with Mr. Thomas or something else entirely. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare him. It felt like possibility, like a chance to build something better, not just for himself, but for everyone he cared about. He took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs, and smiled. Whatever came next, he was ready for it. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. There was a light at the end of the tunnel, and for the first time in a long time, Tommy could see it clearly.